not presenting itself as an ideological bulwark against capitalism that is currently perishing and uh, turning into fascism. Let's watch Overzealots, how rich countries keep poor countries in poverty and why. Oh, damn. Starts off strong with yellow parenti. God damn.
The third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation, namely that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
Almost 40 years later, and this still holds true. When we hear the word colonialism, some may associate it with an outdated system of exploitation and coercion, one that took place a long time ago, and although it was wrong, we grew past it and learned from our mistakes. But unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that, although you may believe that this depravity is ancient history, it's not. It's just advanced with the times. Instead of subjugation by way of guns, whips, chains, and soldiers, the imperial forces of today use something that seems a little cleaner, a little more professional. They use debt. Instead of colonialism, we've moved to a system of neocolonialism. Some of the many antagonists responsible for condemning the developing world to a cycle of debt and exploitation are none other than our international financial institutions, specifically the IMF and the World Bank. So how did we get here?
He literally stole from multiple pharma companies. Bernie Sanders stole what? This is America we need to bravely defend. Dude, I am noticing that the discourse is getting progressively dumber. It's getting to a point where it's like you are hallucinating. And you don't even know what you're hallucinating. I think what you tried to say was that you misunderstood fake news, and you tried to say Bernie got money from pharmaceutical corporations because you don't understand how donations work or political contributions work. But you're too stupid to even understand the fake information. So now you're saying like, oh, Bernie Sanders stole from pharma. Are you in favor? Like, what does that even mean? What does that tell me about your worldview? We are in such a dire situation that I am begging the fucking morons in my chat to at least do fake news correctly. Yeah, Bernie Sanders goes against the Constitution. You're right. Fuck the Constitution. Did your research from what? Don't do research from government. Do your own, bro. There is perhaps no better indication that I'm about to hear some of the dumbest shit I've ever heard in my entire life than a guy who says, I did my own research, bro. Do your own research, bro. I've never had somebody go, do your own research, bro, and then follow that up with like anything that is remotely comprehensible.
The IMF and the World Bank were established after the Great Depression and the Second World War to maintain global financial and economic stability. Although the war helped stimulate the global economy due to wartime production and expenditures, there was a concern that the world would revert back to the economic policies that exacerbated the Great Depression. Since slipping back into economic turmoil was such a genuine worry at the time, 44 nations sent a total of 730 delegates to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for a conference dealing with world monetary and financial policy. This gathering is known simply as the Bretton Woods Conference. Out of this conference came the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Bank. The purpose of the IMF was to promote international monetary cooperation and ensure financial stability by stabilizing exchange rates, promoting economic policies, offering financial support or loans to member countries, facilitating trade, and so on. It's important to keep in mind that at the time, the US dollar was backed by gold and other countries' currencies were fixed to the US dollar, so having an organization, like the IMF, mandated with monitoring exchange rates and lending monies to countries who may be facing balance of payment issues made sense. However, since this system ended in the early 70s with the abandonment of the gold standard, you would think that the role of the IMF would shrink or disappear completely, but no. From 1970 to 1975, the volume of lending more than doubled in real terms, and the IMF's influence persists to this day. The IMF, like the World Bank, is not actually a bank, but it nonetheless lends money. We'll get into why this is detrimental in a bit. The way the IMF is set up is as follows. Member countries pay a quota, which is essentially a subscription. The wealthier a country is, the more money they contribute to the
Where's that chatter that said the mods never pinned the video that we're watching? Where the fuck is that chatter? Not this one.
IMF. The more money they contribute to the IMF, the more of the vote share they have. This weighted system leads to disparities in the vote share and allows for rich Western countries to exercise political influence and power over poorer nations. They can champion policies that benefit rich Western interests at the expense of developing countries who have little to no say in the matter. To illustrate the absurdity of this system, a country like Ethiopia, with a population of 70 million, has half the vote share of Luxembourg, which has a population of only 500,000. And for years, the whole of sub-Saharan Africa had only 4.6% of the votes in the fund. This weighted voting system, predicated on wealth over population size, gives the US alone, and any 4 other G7 members acting together without the US, the ability to block policy decisions and exercise their power over developing nations. It doesn't help that the head of the IMF is always a European and the head of the World Bank is always an American. I hope you can see where this is going. Let's take a quick look at the World Bank. Like the IMF, it was created during the Bretton Woods Conference. While the two institutions are often seen as siblings, the World Bank focuses more on funding development projects and reconstruction around the world. Both institutions lend money, but they do so in a predatory way. Through the use of debt, they keep poor nations trapped in cyclical poverty, and they enable wealthy countries to exert political influence over them. This system undermines the sovereignty and prosperity of these developing nations, all while the institutions responsible for this mess claim to be motivated by the goal of spreading wealth and development. Here's how it works. During the Cold War, when the struggle for
Chatters, the video that is pinned is the correct video. How rich countries keep poor countries in poverty and why. Why are you guys still complaining about the video not being pinned or where the video is? So many of you just don't know how to read and don't care. and just are in here, I think, to just cry and complain.
But that explosion
No, it's not the previous video. I just clicked on it. It's the correct video. It's the video that we're watching.
Political influence and global hegemony between the West and its allies and the Soviets and their allies transpired, Western banks and institutions encouraged developing countries to take out massive loans. This process was often predatory and extremely irresponsible. These developing nations would be told that they needed IMF and World Bank loans to modernize, and debt was framed as a necessary tool for development. The IMF and the World Bank often ended up loaning money to corrupt leaders and dictators who appropriated the funds for personal use and left their country in debt. Whenever they successfully convinced a developing nation to take out a loan with them, conditionalities were part and parcel of the deal. Meaning, if a developing country took out a loan with the IMF or the World Bank, that country needed to adopt specific policy prescriptions. Those policy prescriptions were designed not to aid the developing country and turn it into an economically sufficient nation, but to prioritize its ability to repay its debt with interest and open up its economy to the West. I should note that if a country was severely...
Yes, the debt offered has serious restrictions on where the money can be utilized, and the money that can be utilized is oftentimes with foreign capital. This is a way to extract natural resources and open up the floodgates of foreign capital into these countries. In many circumstances, it's also designed in a way where you won't be able to pay back the debt. So once that moment comes, you can then, by force, implement austerity measures and privatize key aspects and key sectors of the economy that might have been previously controlled by the government. After that privatization, you bring in foreign capital to purchase these things for pennies on the dollar. This is how it works.
impoverished, the IMF would impose either
Like what China is doing with the One Belt, One Road. Ironically enough, China so far has not done this with the One Belt, One Road. Don't take my word for it. Take the word of Foreign Policy Magazine and many other thinkers who are not exactly pro-China and are actually biased against China, but still recognize that this is not what the Chinese debt trap looks like. There are numerous articles. I think one of them that I can recall is called the Chinese debt trap myth. China not only does not implement austerity or force Chinese capital, China also simultaneously offers better loan conditions, no restrictions whatsoever, and has, on numerous occasions, actually voluntarily engaged in loan forgiveness. Yeah. Imagine the U.S. aid funded. Imagine being the U.S. aid funded, CIA backed Voice of America having to type out an article that is literally at odds with what some random chatter has decided China is doing in an effort to be like, oh, well, this is an ownage. Spreading lies once again. Spreading lies once again. So you're like the Atlantic.
In the past 2 decades,
The fucking Bloomberg, like the Atlantic, Bloomberg, Voice of America. I'm not just coming up with this on my own, dumbass. Why don't you go and address the CIA's very own Voice of America? These are not exactly communist nor pro-Chinese outlets. You're no different than a Trump supporter. It's literally what Trump supporters do when they're faced with information. They just like, instead of questioning what they previously knew or their lack of knowledge, they turn around and just immediately attack the source. The source that I'm utilizing is quite literally an openly anti Chinese source. He's an Epstein sex cultist. They're always on the same beat. I've argued with them on their own links, and they just refuse to listen and call you brainwashed. It doesn't make any sense. Like, there's plenty to criticize China on. It's just that this is objectively not a real boundary to criticize them on. So much so that, like, Western media that is not exactly pro-China at all, including the Voice of America that gets paid to be anti-Chinese, has actively written about how our understanding, our former understanding of like the Chinese debt trap and how similar it is to the IMF processes is just completely wrong.
They're a low interest rate or no interest at all, but don't let this fool you. The intentions here were not altruistic. Interest or not, the goal was to entrap indebted countries and use them to pursue the interests of the West. To quote John Perkins, author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, whose job for years was to try and get developing countries to take out these predatory loans, I would work to bankrupt the countries that received those loans, after they had paid Maine and other US contractors, of course, so that they would be forever beholden to their creditors, and so they would present easy targets when we needed favors, including military bases, UN votes, or access to oil and other natural resources. Now let's get back to those loan conditionalities. The IMF and the World Bank forced borrowing countries to adhere to a set of economic reforms and policy prescriptions known as structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. SAPs fit snugly within the neoliberal era, and they forced borrowing countries to implement privatization of state-owned enterprises, trade liberalization through the removal of tariffs, subsidies, and so forth, deregulation, currency devaluation, and austerity in the form of cuts to public services, healthcare, education, etc. The goal was to get these indebted nations to repay their debts with interest at the expense of their impoverished populations. We'll get into specific examples in a bit. The IMF and the World Bank came to adopt what is referred to as the Washington Consensus of neoliberal growth strategies. If you don't know what neoliberalism means, I like to use David Harvey's definition, which goes like this. Neoliberalism is a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. The role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional
which means that under neoliberalism, the state can actually engage in market reforms or market regulation as long as it is done at the behest of improving market competition, or rather, improves private enterprise and their standing.
Framework appropriate to such practices. The state has to guarantee, by force if need be, the proper functioning of markets. If markets do not exist in areas such as land, water, education, healthcare, social security, or environmental pollution, then they must be created by state action if necessary. But beyond these tasks, the state should not venture. Deregulation, privatization, and withdrawal of the state from many areas of social provision have been all too common. Put very simply and charitably, neoliberalism is the idea that free markets, privatization, and minimal government intervention after the state intervenes to create and prop up markets, of course, causes economic growth and prosperity. However, a critic of the theory such as myself would argue that neoliberalism increases inequality, guts the public services that help so many people, and prioritizes the rich and powerful at the expense of everyone else, as we will see later in this video. Not to mention, Western interests often impose neoliberal policies on developing countries under the pretense of fostering prosperity, but wealthy Western nations did not achieve their own economic success by following such policies. In fact, they often did the exact opposite. To quickly summarize before we go any further, what I've told you so far is a story of international financial institutions operating at the behest of rich Western interests that prey on underdeveloped nations by convincing and sometimes forcing them to take out massive loans that come with neoliberal strings attached that ultimately transform these indebted developing countries into neocolonial outposts whose sole purpose in the eyes of the Western world is to service their debt, be perpetually beholden to their creditors, and serve as cheap labor and exporting hubs for the imperial core. If any of what I just said sounds hyperbolic, let's look at the example of Somalia and how these international financial institutions decimated it to the point of complete economic collapse. Somalia is just one of the many countries that fell victim to the predation of the IMF and the World Bank. Throughout the Cold War, Somalia had been the recipient of Western loans and aid, and by the time the early 80s came around, it found itself with debt that it couldn't pay off. The IMF and the World Bank then subjected Somalia to neoliberal structural adjustment programs so they could more effectively service their debt. Prior to the IMF and World Bank's intervention, Somalia was in a much better position. To quote Mikhail Chossudovsky's The Globalization of Poverty, Somalia was a pastoral economy, meaning an
Dude, Overzealots is one of my new favorite YouTube pages. Straight up. Banger after banger. Go give them a follow. It's great.
economy where livestock farming is central. Based on exchange between nomadic herdsmen and small agriculturalists, nomadic pastoralists accounted for 50% of the population. Despite recurrent droughts, Somalia remained virtually self-sufficient in food until the 70s. The IMF World Bank intervention in the early 1980s contributed to exacerbating the crisis of Somali agriculture. The economic reforms undermined the fragile exchange relationship between the nomadic economy and the sedentary economy. A very tight austerity program was imposed on the government, largely to release the funds required to service Somalia's debt. Put simply, the IMF and the World Bank intervened in Somalia to restructure its governance in a way that would prioritize its ability to pay off its debt and further enrich Western nations. The policies imposed upon Somalia were the typical neoliberal ones I mentioned earlier: cuts to public spending, currency devaluation, trade liberalization, and privatization. Here's how those policies looked in action. By forcing Somalia to open up its economy to foreign imports as part of the IMF World Bank trade liberalization stipulation, foreign grain in the form of either food aid or cheap grain imports flooded Somalia. You would think this sounds like a nice thing, a bunch of free or really cheap food given to a country. How could that possibly be harmful? Well, it ended up displacing local farmers and local grain markets. The cheap grain imports and food aid undercut local grain producers and ultimately destroyed Somalia's ability to produce grain for itself. Why would people purchase grain locally when they could take advantage of the cheap grain imports flooding their country? This is noteworthy because, as I mentioned earlier, Somalia was virtually food self-sufficient prior to the IMF and World Bank meddling. Side note, remember how I mentioned that rich Western countries didn't use neoliberal policies to build their own wealth? Well, the cheap grain imports and food aid that flooded Somalia, ultimately destroying its ability to produce its own grain, came from Western governments that subsidized their own agricultural sectors to create a surplus. Meanwhile, the IMF forced the Somali government to cut spending and subsidies in its agricultural sector. The Somali government was pressured to reduce spending on veterinary care, infrastructure, and food subsidies, leaving herders and farmers without the support they needed to keep their livestock healthy. Livestock was very important to Somalia. Remember how I said it was a pastoral economy? In fact, up until the early 80s, livestock contributed to 80% of Somali export earnings. Once these public spending cuts were enacted, the government...
Yeah, neoliberalism... neoliberalism is to say that neoliberalism never impacted like Western nations and they were only enforced often through the debt trap on developing nations is not entirely correct. Because neoliberalism was a self-inflicted wound under the Thatcher regime in the UK and under the Reagan regime in the United States of America. So, inevitably, the profit seekers would, of course, go back and dominate their own home states as well.
Government also had to cut spending on healthcare and education. The money they saved in these areas went to servicing their debts, but These spending cuts negatively impacted the Somali population, who no longer had access to government programs that had been so beneficial. As a consequence of the trade liberalization policy, Somalia was made completely dependent on the West, therefore making it easier for Western nations.
Yeah, first tested out before in Chile by the United States of America and by the UK with Pinochet. Ironically enough, it was, again, that wasn't exactly a fair and free and just transition to neoliberalism. That was done by force. But after all, like I said, it does not matter what kind of force exists when you're doing an implementation of neoliberalism. As long as there are market reforms, government intervention is a necessity at times. You can have a dictator implement neoliberalism, and that's still good. That is still overall beneficial. This is the attitude.
To exert political influence over Somalia. The US and other rich countries, by subsidizing their own agricultural sectors to create a surplus of grain, dumping that surplus into developing countries to artificially lower their prices and eventually destroy their grain markets, would force these developing nations into a position where they had to keep importing more grain from the rich Western countries, expanding Western agribusiness and funneling more wealth away from poorer nations in the developing world. In 1981, the IMF forced Somalia to reduce the value of its currency, the Somali shilling. This, combined with public spending cuts, made everything more expensive, especially fuel, fertilizer, and farming supplies. As a result, farmers struggled. They could no longer import the now unaffordable goods they needed to keep their livestock healthy. The average Somali had less purchasing power to buy food and essentials, and roads and infrastructure started falling apart because the materials needed for upkeep became unaffordable. Currency devaluation was a very common SAP policy. Although it made life harder for the people of Somalia or any other country subjected to it, currency devaluation made exports more appealing on the world stage. It also made Somali labor cheaper for foreign corporations and their powerful currencies. Remember how I just went on a massive diatribe about how Western imports of surplus grain strategically decimated Somalia's ability to produce food for itself? Well, that was only part of the plan. The other part was to turn Somalia and many other countries like it into exporting hubs for raw materials. Since Somalia's currency was devalued so low in comparison to the US dollar and other powerful currencies, they couldn't import much because it was too expensive for them. They couldn't produce grain for themselves either because of the imports that ruined their grain markets, so they had to focus on exporting raw materials to earn revenue. Somalia was forced to focus on exporting so-called high-value-added fruits, vegetables, oilseeds, cotton, and other raw materials instead of producing food for their local population. Since the Somali shilling was devalued, it became very cheap for Western countries with their powerful currencies to purchase these Somali raw materials. By 1989, debt servicing obligations represented almost 200% of export earnings, meaning even with the revenue Somalia was earning from exporting their raw materials, it still wasn't enough to service their debts, let alone enrich the country. This pattern played out in many countries subjected to structural adjustment programs. Poorer nations were forced.
Didn't we do this to China too? How come they turn out so different? China was in a fortuitous position with the Sino-Soviet split, so America actually had an opportunity to maybe not dominate China in a similar capacity because they were also seemingly playing ball in terms of like becoming a manufacturing hub. And a communist revolution, no, it doesn't matter if someone is a... no, that actually helped them rebuild and utilize the foreign capital in a way that actually benefited the broad subsects of society. But ultimately, that's why I say it's the Genghis Gambit, where they basically were able to okay, this is a good take. Yes, they basically were able to leverage their... What is happening with my freaking alerts today? God damn it. They were able to leverage their size and labor force and climb up the value chain, value-added chain without being completely dominated. The other aspect of it, or the political aspect of it, also was due to the Sino-Soviet split. So they weren't as aggressive. They were not as aggressive with China. where they were like, this is a manufacturing hub. They're playing ball. It's fine. It's actually very beneficial for our capitalist corporations to manufacture over there. And they're not seemingly, they will never develop and be able to, become a market competitor, a nation that is competitive to the United States of America. And B, that if we maintain a decent relationship with China without like dominating them too hard, perhaps they won't restore an allegiance to the USSR. The Sino-Soviet split was the reason the Soviet Union, or more broadly, an economic system independent of capitalism, fell. China forsake global socialism and camaraderie with the USSR for American capital, and for that reason, Deng can never be forgiven. Well, Sino-Soviet split also, in my opinion, saved China from being completely dominated. Deng saved China from the socialism box you get put into by America. He did a lot of bad, but his cozying up to the USA was important. He showed how their huge population could be used by the West and their willingness to liberalize, which is now being undone by Xi, and is why a lot of Chinese don't like Deng that much. Deng didn't do the Sino-Soviet split. It was Mao law. Yeah, that chatter is just anti-China in general. But yes, the Sino-Soviet split is ultimately the reason why America's relationship with China dramatically changed, in my opinion. This is a pro-China stream, so chatter can leave. No, you can be, you can have dissenting opinions. It's fine.
Forced to export raw materials to wealthier countries, which then used those raw materials for production. However, because structural adjustments stripped these poorer nations of their ability to develop domestic industries, they were unable to manufacture goods for themselves. As a result, they had to buy back finished products from the rich countries, often at significantly higher prices than what they had originally earned from exporting the raw materials. This exploitative dynamic is known as unequal exchange. In addition to everything I've mentioned so far, privatization campaigns were introduced. State-owned sectors, including agricultural and banking services, were privatized. They were sold off to private investors, which often benefited foreign corporations and Somali elites, while the rest of the Somali population was left to suffer. These privatizations made it so that foreign private interests could benefit from the revenues generated by sectors that were previously owned by the Somali government. So at this point, you might be asking, why did the IMF and World Bank impose these SAPs onto these countries when they clearly didn't work, when they clearly didn't help the people of Somalia or Sudan or Haiti or the multitude of other countries that were sacrificed in the name of neocolonialism? And the answer to that question is, they did work. The SAP...
Dumb question. Why accept these deals in the first place? Sometimes it's corrupt leadership, cozying up to the West. Other times it's desperation. It saved China, but at what cost? There is no international bulwark against capitalism, and upcoming genuine socialist movements don't have any support from the largest so-called socialist states. Save China for the sake of the socialist project? Yeah, no, I've mentioned this before, but China, even when it's like beneficial to its own geopolitical interests, in its own fucking backyard, does not actually, you are stupid, man, does not actually try to beef up any sort of like Maoist movements or any sort of socialist movements on ideological boundaries. It's just the way it is. China cares about China more than anything else. They do not care about a global socialist project, even if it's beneficial for China. Anyway, when is it not corruption? Don't they see the results in other countries, or they just need immediate money at the time? Well, if it's corruption, then there is no popular support or anger. There's usually popular anger towards IMF debt, but it doesn't really amount to anything.
These benefited exactly who they were intended to benefit, like foreign corporations and investors who gained access to cheap labor and exports due to the privatization campaigns and the opening up of the Somali economy, and Western governments, the IMF and the World Bank, who gained political influence over the country and benefited from loan repayments. Although these SAPs were implemented under the promise of development or whatever the fuck, they came at the expense of the Somali people. Somalia, once food self-sufficient, experienced a devastating famine that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Instead of fostering growth, the debt that was
So what exactly are they doing with the Belt and Road Initiative? Why would they forgive loans? What, you think they're doing it for socialism? No, they're doing it to develop a secondary market so that if America decides to go into an all-out trade war, for example, China, one, simultaneously will be able to call in good favors from many of these other nations, and two, will be able, in terms of United Nations, if it still remains, but then also they'll be able to have a second market that they can sell to. They also get ease of access to natural resources. It's literally not dissimilar to the IMF World Bank structure. It's just done in a more ethical manner. Because in most circumstances, it is mutually beneficial. You get ease of access to natural resources, or almost complete control over natural resources. You end up developing these markets so you can sell to them. That's it. It's kind of weird for leftists from the imperial core who have benefited from the colonial and neo-colonial fruits to now just do nothing and expect their former victim to come save them now for some reason. I mean, it's understandable that leftists in the imperial core would still hope that China would do more to, I don't know, actively target the growing fascist movement around the planet. I've also always maintained the position that without the USSR, the social democratic reforms in Europe would be non-existent. If China is seen as a competitive threat ideologically to capitalism, then just like Democrats and liberals that concede and capitulate to fascism right now in an effort to maintain their governing coalitions, you would see the very same thing happening in a lot of these countries in the opposite direction. Russia is a truly anti-fascist country? Sure. Okay, chatter. Yeah, definitely. They're definitely also very socialist still.
supposed to aid Somalia only further enriched the developed world and the international financial institutions that issued the loans, while Somalia's people suffered. These debts and foreign influence in the country eventually helped lead to a full-on economic collapse in Somalia. I focused on Somalia for this video, but this process was replicated all throughout the developing world. Debt.
Expecting China to save you was like right wingers expecting Trump to save them. You're a fool if you're waiting for a savior. Oh my God. I'm not. I'm just simply telling you what is going on. I don't know why this is so frustrating for a lot of people. When I say China is not presenting itself as an ideological bulwark against capitalism that is currently perishing and turning into fascism. I'm explaining why China's not doing that. Some people get mad and say that the expectation that China should be doing that is ridiculous. I don't think it's that ridiculous. I think there is an argument to be made about self-preservation even for Chinese interests if they were to actively undermine growing fascist movements around the globe, because fascism does not simply go away, at least historically. They only perish when they have to be combated militarily. Wait till 2035. We're still in the early phase of socialism. 2035 is the goal for possibly starting up an international socialist movement again. Yeah, well, we'll see. I'll be dead by then, so.
Was used to hook these poor countries in, and the structural adjustment program served to exploit them for all they had. SAPs also pose a significant threat to the healthcare systems of the affected countries, and women and children seem to bear the brunt of the suffering. To quote an article about structural adjustment programs published in the journal Public Health Reviews, policies adopted in adherence with structural adjustment programs frequently bear consequences for the functioning of health systems, with implications for child and maternal outcomes. Governments may be under explicit or implicit pressure to cut social spending in order to meet fiscal targets, thereby reducing the fiscal space in which healthcare systems can operate. In conclusion, the exploitation and...
It's not 2050, it's 2035? Yeah, well, let's see how the next 4 years under Donald Trump looks like. Okay? And then we'll see. We'll reconsider when we get to the end of the next 4 years, end of the second Trump term. I mean, you are pissing off a lot of crazies. No, I don't mean just like me. I'm talking about the supercharged growth of fascist movements. Also, I'm looking at what China has done in the past. Like, they're not. Let's just say they're not allergic to aligning themselves with some pretty bad people if it suits their immediate benefit. Look at Myanmar. That's a great example. They will both collaborate with the junta and also simultaneously anti-government forces, depending on what suits their purpose. Same goes for, I mean, even with respect to their allegiance with Russia, that's a more understandable one. Russia is a nation state, a powerful one, okay, and an energy provider. But, you know, we'll see. Or their trade relations with Israel. That's another one.
Plunder that devastated the developing world during the days of colonialism has not been eradicated. It's just been reorganized. I'll close this video out with an excerpt from one of my favorite authors, the late David Graeber. For almost 2 years, I had lived in the highlands of Madagascar. Shortly before I arrived, there had been an outbreak of malaria. It was a particularly virulent outbreak because malaria...
This guy's awesome. He's saying Russia is very much against fascism. Chinese government goes against humanity. We can't have people like Bernie, who are very far socialists, infiltrate one of the big powers, especially people like Fauci, life in prison. Okay, dude. I'm just going to ban you for your own sake. Okay? Poor guy. Just losing his mind.
Had been wiped out in highland Madagascar many years before, so that after a couple of generations, most people had lost their immunity. The problem was, it took money to maintain the mosquito eradication program, since there had to be periodic tests to make sure mosquitoes weren't starting to breed again, and spraying campaigns if it was discovered that they were. Not a lot of money, but owing to IMF-imposed austerity programs, the government had to cut the monitoring program. 10,000 people died. I met young mothers grieving for lost children. One might think that it would be hard to make a case that the loss of 10,000 human lives is really justified in order to ensure that Citibank wouldn't have to cut its losses on one irresponsible loan that wasn't particularly important to its balance sheet anyway. If history shows anything, it's that there's no better way to justify relations founded on violence to make such relations seem moral than by reframing them in the language of debt. Above all, because it immediately makes it seem that it's the victim who's doing something wrong.
Will there be a Trump three-peat? Who knows? But for the time being, let's get to the fallen state.